Hey, welcome back. This lesson's been all about bringing Exchange Server 2016 into an existing Exchange Server 2013 organization. And we've done that. We've deployed an Exchange 2016 mailbox server, and we've deployed an Exchange 2016 Edge Transport server. So now what I want to do is I want to wrap up this lesson by talking about some post-installation tasks. And you can see some of these tasks on the screen. Now, there are a couple things I need to mention before I start going over the individual task. First of all, this list isn't all-encompassing by any stretch of the imagination. The actual post-installation tasks that you'll want to perform are going to vary widely depending on what types of servers you deployed. For example, in some situations, it might be necessary to associate a certificate with a mailbox server. In other cases, you may not have to do that. You might be perfectly okay with just using a self-signed certificate, particularly if you're working in a lab environment or a really small-scale deployment. But the items that I've listed on this slide represent some of the more common post-installation tasks. Now, another thing that I need to mention is that some of these are Microsoft best practices, and others are just things that I've kind of come to do over the years that I found work really well. So we've kind of got a mix going here. So with that said, let's go over the list. The first thing on the list is enter a product key, because until you do that, your new Exchange servers are going to function in trial mode. They'll still work. You can do anything you want to with them, but eventually that trial period will expire. So it's a good idea to go ahead and enter a product key just so you don't get surprised by anything later on. The next thing, verify that Exchange Server is recognized by using the get-exchange server commandlet. In a way, we've already kind of done this in some of the other videos, but it's a good idea just to make sure that Exchange Server is recognized and that you can see all of your servers from the Exchange Management Shell. Then we have some logs that we want to review. Specifically, you're going to want to check the Exchange setup log and the application log in Event Viewer just to make sure that there aren't any catastrophic errors that you're not aware of. Generally, you're probably not going to find any problems, but it never hurts to be sure. Then we have rename the mailbox database and move the database and transaction logs. Admittedly, these are some of my own best practices. These aren't really on Microsoft's list of post-installation tasks. But let me take just a moment and talk about the reasons why I've included them. Exchange Server 2016 tends to use some fairly long mailbox database names. You'll see an example of that in a few minutes. And I found that by renaming the mailbox database, I can shorten the name and make it a little bit easier to work with, because very often in Exchange, you're going to end up having to use the Exchange Management Shell to perform various tasks. And those tasks are a lot easier to perform if you are able to shorten the mailbox database names, as opposed to having to type some great big long convoluted name. Now, move the database and its transaction logs. That's long been a Microsoft best practice. You want the database on one drive, you want the transaction logs on another drive so that they're separated from one another. Because if you happen to lose the database, those transaction logs are going to help you with the data recovery process. And you want both of those to be off of your C drive because you don't want system file access to diminish database access performance. So we've got a lot of different things that we're going to do, but none of these tasks are overly time consuming or overly complicated. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first task that we want to do is to enter a product key. Now, I'm not actually going to enter a product key because for legal reasons I can't show you my Exchange product key, but I do want to show you the process. Now, you can do this through the Exchange Management Shell or you can do it through the Exchange Admin Center. If you're going to use the Exchange Management Shell, enter the set-exchange server commandlet, followed by the name of your Exchange server, and then use the product key switch, and then just type the name of your product key. It's pretty simple to do. Now, in the Exchange Admin Center, you're going to go to Servers, and then you're going to select your server and click Edit, and then go to General, and use the Change Product Key option. I'll show you what this looks like in just one second. But before I do that, I need to point out that regardless of which of these methods you use, you're going to need to restart the Microsoft Exchange Information Store service after you enter the product key. Otherwise, Exchange isn't going to recognize that the product key is in place. So let me go ahead and show you what it looks like to enter a product key in the Exchange Admin Center, and I'll also show you how to restart the Information Store. Okay, so here we are in the Exchange Admin Center, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Servers, and here's a list of the servers in our Exchange Server organization. And by the way, I mentioned that one of the tasks that you're going to want to complete is to verify that all your servers are seen. And I mentioned that we were going to do this through the Exchange Management shell, and we are. I'm going to show you how to do that. But this is another way that you can verify that. We have 4 servers in our organization, and all 4 are showing up here. So what I want to do now is I want to pick my Exchange 2016 mailbox server. This is the server I'm going to put the product key on. I'm going to select that, and then I'm going to click on Edit. And you'll notice I'm taken to the General tab by default. And here's where we can put in a product key. You can see it says enter a valid product key, and I can just type X a bunch of times to illustrate the point. And then when I was done, I would just click on save, and my product key was in there. But remember what I said a moment ago. Let me cancel out of this. We're going to need to restart the Microsoft Exchange Information Store service. So let me switch over to my Exchange server and I'll show you how to do that. So here I am back on my Exchange server, and what we're going to do is right click on the start button and go to run, and I'm going to type services.msc, and that's going to bring up a list of all of the services that are installed on this system. Now, I should mention while this is coming up that restarting the Microsoft Exchange Information Store service is going to disrupt mailbox connectivity. So if you have users who are actively using mailboxes on this server, then you may want to do this late at night while nobody's online. So here's our list of services. I'm going to expand this to make it larger. Now what we have to do is find the Microsoft Exchange Information Store service. So I'll scroll down. Here's a lot of services related to Microsoft Exchange. I'll widen this so that we can see it. And here's the Microsoft Exchange Information Store, and you can see that it's running. So I'm just going to right click on the service and click Restart. And the service is restarting. And sometimes this takes just a second. And the service has restarted. So we're in good shape here. The product key is entered. Everything's good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the Service Control Manager. So here we are back on an Exchange server, and I promised you earlier that I was going to show you how to confirm that all of your Exchange servers were recognized. Now we should have 4 different servers listed, and the way that we would find that out is by typing get-exchange server and pressing enter, and here we have all 4 of our servers, so we're in good shape there. Now, if you think back to our list of post-installation tasks, you'll recall that the next thing that was on the list was to check some log files. And the first log file that I want to check is the Exchange setup logs. We'll want to make sure that there weren't any serious errors in the log. And the way that we do that is to just open up File Explorer, and we'll go to C, and here's a folder called Exchange setup logs. That's where our log is at. So I'll open that up, and then here's the Exchange setup log. This is a .log file, but by default Windows Explorer hides file name extensions, so all we see is Exchange setup. That's fine. So I'll just open this up, and we can see the installation process. Now, as you can see, this is some very detailed information, and we do have an error right here. Setup encountered a problem while validating the state of the Active Directory. Normally in a production environment, that would be a big issue. In this particular case, I ran setup a couple of times. The first time I ran it, I was running on a virtual machine, and I had forgotten to power up my domain controller. So that's the reason for this particular error. So there's a perfectly valid reason why this error happened. But in a production environment, you probably won't see something like this, at least I hope not. But it's a good idea just to kind of go through and make sure that you don't have any serious errors in here. So let me close this out. And then the next thing that we need to check is the application log within the event viewer. Okay, so here's the event viewer. I'll make this larger for you. And the first thing that I want to look at is the application log. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here to Windows Logs, and I'll expand that and select the application log. And here we can see events related to applications installed on this server, namely Exchange. So you can see that we've got a couple of errors, and we have some informational events. These are things that we would probably want to review. Now, another place that you might want to look is under Applications and Service Logs. Let me expand this. And you'll notice that we have some other containers here. We have MS Exchange Management, for example. And this contains some more Exchange-related events. So it looks like we have an edge synchronization issue. But as I look more closely at this, you'll recall in the previous video, we performed a manual edge synchronization. And the event that's highlighted is informational, and we can see that the commandlet succeeded. We were successful in starting an edge synchronization. All of these errors were older events from before we performed an edge synchronization. So it appears everything's okay here. So that's just a couple of places that you might check within the event viewer just to make sure that you're not having any unanticipated problems with Exchange Server. So with that said, I'm going to switch back to my PowerPoint deck and we'll start talking about renaming and moving databases and transaction logs. So as I explained earlier, I like to rename my Exchange mailbox databases because the names that Exchange uses by default tend to be long and convoluted, and I like to give them a friendlier name just to make them a little bit easier to work with. So the way that we do that is by using the get-mailbox database commandlet. That's going to provide us a list of all of the Exchange Server mailbox databases within the Exchange organization. Then, once we've identified the database that we want to rename, we use the set-mailbox database commandlet. We provide the database name, that's the full big long default name, and then we use the name parameter and the new name that we want to assign. So it's a pretty simple process. But keep in mind that renaming mailbox databases and moving mailbox databases have the potential to disrupt connectivity. So you want to do this at a time when you don't have users working on these databases. So let me switch back over to my Exchange server and we'll take a look at how this works. So here we are back in Exchange with the Exchange Management shell open. So I'm going to go ahead and clear the screen here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to type get-mailbox database. And this is going to provide us a list of all of the mailbox databases in our Exchange server organization. So we have two mailbox databases. You can see that one's on an Exchange 2013 server, the other's on my Exchange 2016 server. And here are the big long database names that I was talking about. So my Exchange 2016 database is called Mailbox Database 14722322746. Kind of a long name. So let's go ahead and change that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type set-mailbox database, and then we have to provide the mailbox database name. That's called mailbox database, and then that great big long number. Now, I don't entirely trust myself to type that number while I'm also trying to record a video, so I'm going to pause this for 1 second while I type that number, and then we'll pick it up here and finish off the command. Okay, so I've typed the number. Hopefully I didn't make any mistakes. And what we need to do now is add the quotation mark and then space dash name. And I'm just going to call this database DB1. Can't get any simpler than that. So I'll press enter. And we don't have any kind of output that's shown, but we can type the get-mailbox database commandlet again. And now we can see that the database name has been changed to DB1. So what we did worked. Let me go ahead and clear the screen. And I need to switch back to my PowerPoint deck for just 1 second. So before we can move a database, we have to know the name of the database that we are going to move. Now, we already know the database name. It's DB1, and we know it because we just renamed the database a second ago. But what if we didn't know the database name? Well, in that type of situation, we could use the get-mailbox database commandlet, just like what you saw a moment ago, to retrieve a list of the database names. Now, for the actual move, what we're going to use is the move-database path commandlet. And we have to follow that commandlet with the name of the database. And then depending on whether we're moving the database itself, the transaction logs, or both, we'll use the -edb file path switch and or the -log folder path switch. So if we're moving the database, then we're going to use -edb file path, and we're going to follow that with both the path and the file name of the database. If we're moving the transaction logs, we're going to use log folder path, and we're going to follow that with the path of the database. So let me show you an example, because I know that's a little bit confusing. So here's an example. This is exactly what we're going to do on my lab server in just a second. We start out with the move database path commandlet, followed by the name of the database. That's DB1 in this case. Now in this case, we're going to be moving both the database and the transaction logs. So I'm using the -edb file path parameter in order to specify that we are going to move the database. And then we're going to move the database to e:/db1. That's going to be the path. And then the file name for the database is going to be db1.edb. So I'm using the file extension edb. Now for moving the transaction logs, I'm going to use the log folder path parameter followed by the path to the folder where I want to store the transaction logs. Now we don't have to specify a file name. All we have to do is specify a path. In this case, f:/db1. So I'm using E drive for the database, F drive for the transaction logs. So let me switch over to my Exchange server and we'll make this happen. So here we are back on the Exchange 2016 mailbox server. And as I said a moment ago, I'm going to put the database on the E drive and the transaction logs on the F drive. So let me open up File Explorer for a second. So you can see that I've got an E drive and an F drive, and it looks like they're both empty, but let's check. If I open this up, there's nothing there. If I open up F, there's nothing there. So we want to create these folders. They're both going to be called DB1. And I could do that through File Explorer by opening this up, right-clicking, and then saying New Folder, and then DB1. Or if I wanted to do it through the Exchange Management Shell, I could do that too. You can see I've created a folder on E called DB1 using File Explorer, but let's create the folder on F using the Exchange Management Shell. So I'm going to switch to F, and I'll do dir to show the directory of that drive. It's empty. So I'm just going to say md, make directory, and I'm going to call this db1. And it looks like the directory was created. I'll type dir, and there's the directory, so we're in good shape there. Let me go ahead and clear the screen. And now that the necessary folders are in place, we'll go ahead and move the database. So to do that, I'm going to type move dash database path, and I'm going to type db1. And if I didn't know the name of the database, I could easily get that by just typing get dash mailbox database, and there's db1. But let's move forward with our move. I had typed move dash database path, and then the database name, which is db1, as you can see above. And then we're going to use the dash adb file path parameter, and that's going to specify that we're moving the database. And I'm going to move that database to e:/db1, and the name of the file is going to be db1.edb. And then we're going to move the transaction logs to the F drive. So I'm going to use the dash log folder path, and then I'm going to specify f:/db1 as the destination. So assuming that I haven't made any typos, I'll press enter and the database will be moved. Now keep in mind, if any users are using this database, then this will disrupt connectivity. So this is something that you want to do while nobody's working on this server. So I press enter, and this process can take a while, especially if you've got a very sizable database at all. This database is more or less empty, so it shouldn't take very long to move, but it is going to take just a second. So I'm going to pause the video for a moment while the move process completes. Okay, so after a couple of minutes, I'm prompted to confirm whether or not I wanted to move the database, and I do. So I'm just going to press Y for yes, and I see another prompt telling me that the database DB1 must be temporarily dismounted, which will make it inaccessible to all users. Do you want to continue? I'll press Y for yes. And we can see the database dismounting. And now the database is being copied. The log files are being copied, and the original log files are being removed. Now it is worth pointing out that this process takes quite a bit longer than what you're seeing here. It's just that through the magic of editing, I'm keeping you from having to wait for the various steps to complete. And the database status is being restored, and the process is finally complete. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and let's just take a look on our E and F drives and see what we've got. So I'll open up File Explorer and go into E, and I'll go into the DB1 folder, and here's our database file. And if I go to F and go to DB1, here are our transaction logs. So we have successfully moved the Exchange Server database and its transaction logs. So that's going to do it for the post-installation tasks.